Hello, viewers. Do I look really, really scary today? Well, that's because today I will be reading you a ghost story. Yes, story time today. In the shadow of the Styx. Here we go. Are you ready? It's very scary. Uh, the the acknowledgements go on for quite a bit of time. Should I read through them? All right, I will. There are many people who have helped me both inadvertently and advertently to get this book written. I probably won't remember them all here, but if I don't name you, it's not deliberate. First, I'd like to thank my beautiful cousin, Dr. Akati Hasiani, who took time out of her busy schedule to edit my first drafts. I'd also like to thank everyone who read any chapters of my book and gave me helpful feedback. A special thanks goes out to Diana Gabaldon, writer extraordinaire, my inspiration, who told me once that the way that you know you're a writer is if you keep going at all odds. I'd also like to thank my friend Eva Andrews, who not only asked that all important question, and then what happened, but also lent her name to one of the characters. My sisters, who encouraged me by reading my work and urged me to keep going. Vicky, who read through my contract. Liz, who helped me with taking author photos. And all those who generally had my back at every step. To Rihanna, for inspiring me to reevaluate what working hard really looks like, and pointing out that we all have the same 24 hours. It's what you do with it that counts. To my son, who thinks I'm the best everything, so he says, I know that you're just saying it because you know which side your bread is buttered on, but I appreciate it all the same. And lastly, I'd like to thank Google for reminding me of quite a few things I'd forgotten about the 90s and what the weather is like in New Orleans. This book was dedicated to my mama, the late Matilda Dina Mwangale Simeo. Thank you for everything. Okay, prologue. Now, the thing about this prologue is that, well, it's kind of an excerpt from another book. See if you can guess which one. When she walked out of the bathroom, which was across the hall from her room, she peeked to see whether Leo had stirred. He was standing in the middle of the room, fully dressed to his black alligator skin boots. Do you have what you need now, Maya? He asked her, his voice slightly huskier than usual. She was startled out of her thoughts by his words. She wasn't sure if all this was happening or he was simply a figment of her imagination. Though, if she were to imagine herself in passionate embrace with anyone, God knows his name wouldn't top her list. Arrogant, insensitive, alligator killing son of a gun, she thought resentfully. Yes, I have what I need, she replied, and pivoted away, heading for the stairs to the attic, where she kept her herbs and the cauldron that sat waiting in the fireplace. Sensation was still shooting through her body in disconcerting aftershocks, and there was something wet running down her legs. She didn't want to think about too much. She could feel her legs wanting to shake with reaction, but she would not let them. She had set her mind to the spell and to try to keep it on the business at hand. He followed her up the stairs. She sighed wistfully. Why couldn't he just go? Ugh. Chapter 1. Ghosts. Phil ran his hand down her naked flesh as she slept, watching her clear white skin in fascinated absorption. She, she was a big girl, his Amazon, from her fiery strawberry hair, inherited from Viking antecedents, long dead, to her piercing green eyes that made him shiver every time she glanced at him. Most days he couldn't believe she was his. His finger trailed down her endless legs, thick and shapely as saplings, ending in long toes gaily painted yellow. She was asleep now, worn out from his passion and hers. A smile played around her rosebud lips even as she dozed. Perhaps she could feel his gaze on her. He whispered in her ear before he bit it playfully. Her smile widened, but she didn't open her eyes or say a word. "Lil me, darling," he drawled, but again she ignored him. He leaned over her and placed a kiss behind her ear while he pressed his already erect member into her backside. Phil was a small guy, except where it really mattered. A shiver ran down her body as his lips touched her flesh, and Phil took it as encouragement. He promptly inveigled one of his legs between hers, widening the space between her legs as he slipped his long, slim fingers into her, kissing her neck all the while. She made a small sound of encouragement, but didn't open her eyes. That was all he needed to position himself to enter her from behind, all the while running his hands softly up and down the insides of her thighs, teasing her with sensation. She moaned sensually, arcing her back to give him more access. Her eyes closed. He thrust suddenly into her, unable to hold back any longer. His eyes widened as the brown of his irises narrowed into pinpoints of pleasure. His mouth opened in a wide, soundless groan as he thrust faster and faster into her, the encouraging noises she made egging him on. It was over in minutes, but neither minded. It had been a long night of celebration. "I don't feel well, Lillian. I don't feel well at all. Are you sure about that pork in that jambalaya?" Phil asked as he came back from his third visit to the bathroom later that morning. "The jambalaya is fine. It's your bloody habit of not washing your hands that is the fucking problem, Phil," Lillian replied irritably. Though if asked, she'd have to admit that she wasn't feeling 100% either. Okay, cool your jets, Lil. I was just asking," Phil replied. "Sorry, long night," Lillian replied contritely. "Really? What were you up to?" Phil said, instantly forgetting his discomfort as he jumped on the bed, facing her as she lay down. Lillian rolled her eyes and turned away from him. She loved Phil with all her heart, but he could be just a smidge more affectionate than she was used to. South London did not encourage loving behavior among its residents. No shade to South London. Phil and Lillian had been enjoying a nice candlelit dinner the evening before to celebrate Lillian's attainment of citizenship in the United States. Phil could hardly understand her strong Cockney accent half the time, but his heart had been hers at first sight, and he hadn't looked back since. The narrow complication of already having a girlfriend hadn't stopped him from walking up to her with a fat bunch of daffodils the first time he saw her and asking her to marry him. She had laughed in his face, but he'd seen the interest in her eyes as they travelled over his 5'4" frame. Small, but well built. The Navajo blood that ran in his veins gifted him his dark hair and brown eyes, and his Spanish ancestry was responsible for the bronze of his skin. And probably his height as well. No shade, seriously. His mother's people were small, if proud Spaniards. Although he was an accountant by trade, he worked over at the Evans Alligator Ranch and therefore indulged in some wrestling with extremely large reptiles. That accounted for his pleasantly muscled frame. When he told Sally that what they had been good, but it was over now, she hadn't been pleased. But it didn't worry him. She would get over it. She had to, because he wasn't going back to her. Especially now that Lillian had agreed to stay. Phil's stomach suddenly went into a cramp, and he collapsed on the floor, squirming in pain. His stomach was churning like it was full of snakes, attempting to exit via the stomach wall instead of following the correct route down to his anus. It actually seemed to undulate. He waited in horror for long writhing fingers to shoot out from it in a burst of black slime and green goo, just like in the movies. Lillian leapt naked from the bed and attempted to straighten him out. Phil! Phil! What's the matter with you? She cried urgently. Should I call someone? A doctor or something? Speak to me! But Phil continued to thrash about on the ground. Lillian stood up and ran to the phone, dialing 999 instinctively before remembering she was in America now and dialing 911. Hello? Hello? Is this emergency services? My boyfriend's in pain. You need to come quick. She shouted down the line, speaking as clearly as possible so they'd understand her. These Americans did not like foreigners. What is the nature of your emergency, ma'am? The voice on the line asked her. This inquiry was too much for Lillian's agitated spirit. She banged the phone down in frustration, looking around desperately for inspiration. Then, shrugging her shoulders, she grabbed the nearest item of clothing, which happened to be her dress from last night. She leaned down and picked Phil up, slinging him over her shoulder in a fireman's lift and running out to the car with him. She grabbed her shoes as she passed at a run and the car keys. Lucky for both of them that Phil was such a diminutive man compared to her frame, which was a strapping 5'8" and 230 pounds. Furthermore, she had been an amateur wrestler for many years before moving to the States to wrestle with alligators on the Evans Alligator Farm in Limaray. Probably say that wrong. She worked there as a keeper and could bench press twice her body weight. It was a match made in heaven. She drove Helpful Leather to the Limaray Clinic, the one run by the missionaries. Dr. Jonathan Ross was on duty, and he took one look at Phil and murmured food poisoning before moving on to the next patient. Lillian wanted to grab at him to make him stay, but he was already out the door. The nurse who came to do triage took Phil's temperature, then hurried out of the treatment room, looking worried. 2 minutes later, Dr. Ross was back, his face graver than before. What has this man eaten today? He asked Lillian. For some reason, he He was fading in and out of her vision, and she didn't know why. The room suddenly went black, and Lillian collapsed on the floor with a thunderous thud. She didn't writhe or moan with pain, but it was clear that whatever afflicted Phil had affected her too. They were both foaming at the mouth. Dr. Ross called gastric lavage in a panic, feeling sorely inconvenienced by all this drama. He had a bottle of 64 Bordeaux waiting for him in his office. Phil was going into cardiac arrest. Dr. Ross shouted for the crash cart. He grabbed the defibrillator and prepared it for use. Just as he was about to administer the shock treatment to Phil's chest, the nurse attending to Lillian cried out in alarm. Lillian's heart was fibrillating too! Dr. Ross went into total panic and ran out of the room. Fuck! He screamed. They're dead! The nurse watched him go in shock. And then the head nurse, Nurse Carrie, grabbed the paddles and rubbed them together. Clear! She shouted and then administered the shock to Phil's chest. Nurse Eva went down on her knees and began to administer CPR on Lillian. There was a candy striper named Harpreet who had just started working at the hospital. She was from India, come to Le Marais for an 18-month exchange program. It was her first day, poor dear, and she was at a complete loss for how to proceed. She looked toward the door and saw an old black woman peering into the room. She was tall and slim, with hair that was fully white and stood up in an untidy halo around her head. She looked crazy, but her caramel eyes were calm and sane. Is everything all right? She asked in a deep, gravelly voice. I'm sorry, what are you doing here? Harpreet asked her uncertainly. I heard a sound like a cry for help. I thought they were calling me. So I came, the woman said. Why would they be calling you? Harpreet asked, not even realizing that she automatically knew who they were. The old woman shrugged her shoulders, a wry look in her eye. Well, I don't say me exactly, but I expect they meant for anyone who could hear to come help, she said. What is your name? Harpreet asked her. Mattia Andrews, at your service. What is yours, dear? Mattia asked her. Harpreet Singh. I am new, she said with a bob of her head. Well, Harpreet, I am afraid it is much too late for either of us to help these two. Their spirits have been severed from their bodies. Bad juju went on here. I can see. Well, I shall be leaving you now. My granddaughter awaits me, Mattia said. Wait! Harpreet shouted, not sure why she didn't want the old lady to leave. Peace, Harpreet. It will be all right, Mattia said, and with a small wave, she was gone. It was like the sound came back on for Harpreet after that. The nurses were shouting, and Dr. Ross was screaming into the phone at reception, calling for backup. On the floor and in the bed, the two corpses lay. The only peaceful, quiet beings about. Or are they? That's the end of that summary. You want to know what happened next? You know what to do. Thank you for staying with me throughout. Good morning,